1. I was 10 years old when this account happened, in the fall of grade 5. My mother, sister, and I were visiting my aunt and uncle and their 2 sons in Kansas while on break from school. My family is from Gyeongju, South Korea, but my father is African American, so we grew up with both cultures and speak English fluently, so it wasn't hard traveling and interacting with others. My aunt is a devoted Christian and really loved bringing us to church with her and a family friend, Sandra. Now, I'm not against going to church, but I don't believe in a set God. Don't attack me. I do, however, believe in a higher power and spent a good portion of my time at a Buddhist temple, where my maternal grandfather is one of the head monks and tomb keeper. So, despite being more spiritually inclined, I would get up early and put on my Sunday best, and would stumble out the door jet-lagged to make it to the service on time. The services always started normally. Greet thy neighbors, welcome the guests, singing, and eventually the preacher would come out and read through scripture. There were times prayers for those in the community would happen, or people coming forward to be saved in the form of baptism. My family normally sat in what my aunt called the best pew in the house. But we didn't sit in that pew alone. There was a man that sat between our family and another family of 3. This man between the families was a killer in the pews. Now I know what you must be thinking, how do I know he was a killer, right? Well, hold on and I'll tell you what I know. Now, let's get back to the topic. The man that sat on the other side of my mother and next to Mr. Hopper was considered an outstanding member of the community. All in all, he seemed just like the typical American family man. He was odd, though. Something about his mannerisms threw my family for a loop. This man would lean over toward my mother to the point his head was almost on her shoulder, and he would take a deep inhale. And my mother would lean away towards me, almost crushing me, and promptly would ask the man, "Can I help you with something?" He smiled and just laughed a bit and shook his head no, and muttered an apology for making us uncomfortable. He started. "It just smells familiar. It makes me remember something. It triggers a deep memory in me." My mom just laughed it off rather uncomfortably and stated it's Sea Island cotton from Bath and Body Works. This has been my mom's favorite scent ever since I can remember, is her signature. And if you've ever smelled it, you would know how fresh and clean the perfume is. So maybe he just was drawn in subconsciously closer like a moth to a flame. But as time progressed and service after service passed, he continued his sniffing ministrations. My mom eventually had enough. This man was creepy and couldn't take the hint to back off. We jumped ship and moved pews the next service to an area more towards the back. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The man must have thought man overboard because he jumped ship and maneuvered through the worshippers to, you guessed it, sit right next to us. This cycle continued up until we boarded our plane to go home. However, this story doesn't end there. Remember I mentioned the family friend Sandra? Well, Sandra was a dental hygienist in Kansas, and she had a neighbor who was also one of her patients get found murdered in her own home. I will not be disclosing her name out of respect for her family and friends. But this woman, may she rest in peace, was found bound with rope and a plastic bag over her head. It was apparent she had been tortured brutally before she passed. Not long after the discovery, another body was found in yet again their own home, and mocking letters started being sent to the local PD station. If you haven't figured it out yet, this was the work of serial killer BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill. He was back after years of silence. Initially, police thought maybe it was a copycat killer since BTK had been quiet for so long. They assumed he died or moved away, among other possibilities. The killings continued for a bit longer, and from what I remember, my aunt and uncle were on edge. Their whole community was. BTK was eventually caught, and I can't tell you all the details regarding that, since I was back home in Korea. But I can tell you we received a terrifying phone call not long after. My aunt and Sandra called to inform us it was over. BTK was caught. Great news, right? We should have slept easily knowing our friends and family were safe. They are no longer prey. BTK wasn't just a serial killer. He was the man from the pews. The one that sniffed my mother consistently. He was Dennis Rader. The thing that scares me most? My mom could have been on his list. She could have been a victim all because we sat in the pews and greeted our neighbor with brotherly love. BTK, do me a favor, and let's not meet again. 2. This happened to me in 2004, but I still get chills thinking about it as I write this. My parents raised me to always pay close attention to my surroundings, and, at least on this occasion, I'm pretty sure it saved my life. It was early to mid-February, and I was visiting Boston, Massachusetts, to complete an annual high school debate tournament. I know, I was very cool in high school. My team was staying at a hotel in Kendall Square near the Charles River. The particular area of Boston where the hotel was located wasn't very busy at night, mainly because the hotel was smack in the middle of an area dominated by offices. In fact, aside from the hotel itself, I remember there being nothing else to speak of on the street where this all happened. The tournament was held across the river, a very short subway ride away. Because of the way my day was scheduled, all my debate rounds were held in different buildings than the rest of my team, and I finished my day later than everyone else. By the time I was finished, the rest of my team was back at the hotel. Having grown up in a big city, I had no problem taking the train by myself, so I caught the subway back to the hotel. I didn't really have any choice in the matter anyway. Now, the exit of the subway station was across the street and around half a block down from the hotel entrance, which was set back from the sidewalk by a huge courtyard. It wasn't a very long walk, but in the bitter cold darkness of a winter night, it certainly felt like it was. The sun has already set by the time I got to my stop. I remember noticing how empty the train was, and how dark it seemed when I reached the top of the escalator stairs and stepped outside. I always find myself slightly disoriented when I get out of the subway, so I stopped and looked around for the hotel entrance. And that's when I saw him. Almost as soon as I stepped outside, a lone jogger ran past the subway entrance. He was dressed in head to toe in black, including gloves and a ski mask. He also wore a black baseball cap on top of the ski mask, which I remember thinking was weird. Aside from the two of us, there was no one else on the street. He passed by me quickly, and being the cautious city boy that I was, I watched him for a moment as he continued down the street. Realizing that the hotel was in the opposite direction, I turned away after a few seconds and crossed the street. I had just made it across to the other side of the street when I heard him, coming from behind me, moving incredibly fast. Footsteps. I turned to quickly look over my shoulder. At some point the jogger had turned around, and he was sprinting diagonally toward me from across the street. By the time I saw him, he had crossed most of the street and was maybe 10 feet away. I'm not ashamed to admit that the fight-or-flight response took over, and I immediately noped the fuck out of there, taking off running for the hotel as fast as I could. A while back I read that looking over your shoulder as you run slows you down, so even though I could still hear his footsteps behind me, I didn't dare turn to see where he was. I just ran, as fast and hard as I could, down the street and through the hotel courtyard. I was still sprinting when I hit the revolving doors, and it was only when the doors swung into the lobby that I looked behind me again. The courtyard was empty. I don't know at what point he stopped chasing me, but I do know that no one takes a diagonal beeline sprint toward a young stranger across an empty street at night, unless they mean to do them some kind of harm. Thankfully, I never found out what his intentions were. For all I know, it could have been just a straightforward mugging. But since 2004, over 20 young men have been found drowned in Boston's waterways, under bizarre circumstances. Sometimes when I think back on the jogger, ski mask and baseball cap obscuring his face, his arms pumping as he ran at me, I wonder if I almost became one of them. So to the jogger in black, let's not meet. 3. I went to college in a rural town in northern New England. Like any college town, it had a few bars that would have trouble with the liquor commissioner and other issues. My senior year in college, a bar reopened with a new owner after having been closed for a number of years. This bar did no advertising or anything else regarding its new opening, and stayed very low-key throughout the year. However, one day, in an effort to escape the crowds of college shenanigans of our regular college bars, myself and 2 friends ventured in. It was clear that business was not too important for them immediately upon walking in. It was the epitome of a dive bar. Cash only, no beer taps, only cheap liquor, broken pool table, and just the dirtiest place of all time. On top of it all, there was just one bartender, who was rather out of place in this small New England town. A man in his late 40s or early 50s named Frankie. My 2 friends and I quickly found a new hangout at this bar. Drinks were cheap, the pool table worked once we figured out how to release the balls for free, and pretty soon we were able to convince Frankie to let us control the music, and get some seriously discounted beverages. As the school year rolled on, we would hang out at the bar 2 or 3 times a week, usually as a pre-game before going out to house parties or more popular bars. But hanging out there frequently, we spent a lot of time conversing with Frankie. The bar continued to stay very under the radar during this time of the year. However, some other patrons began to use the bar towards the end of fall semester. Although some popularity came from the college students, it also attracted some local members of a biker gang and some Chinese gamblers. By this time of the year, we had developed a good relationship with Frankie. He would let us drink completely for free and told us many tales from his life. The first red flag we got on the stories Frankie began to tell. Aside from just being generally creepy in regards to women, he would never tell us full details. He would allude to mafia connections and military service, of great conquests of women and living a high life. But none of the details added up. The explanation we came up with at this point was simple. Frankie was just a bored, middle-aged man who got kicks from trying to sound cool to college kids and hitting on college women. Assuming this was the case, we were willing to live with his lies for the payoff of drinking for free. When the second semester began, the bar suddenly became immensely popular. Our once quiet hangout spot had lines out the door and even hired several other bartenders. All the bartenders he hired were beautiful college girls. They didn't last long. Maybe a week or 2 at most. Probably they quickly became creeped out by Frankie and quit. But our loyalty through the first semester paid off, and we continued to drink for free, get behind the bar, and act like we owned the place. Frankie began to invite us to things outside of the bar as well. Mostly he would call us up at weird times of the week and ask us if we wanted to hop in his Mercedes and go down to Foxwoods Casino with his Chinese friends. Although intrigued by the idea, none of us ever took him up on any of these offers, until summer came around. After the school year ended, my friends all moved out of town, but I remained due to an internship I had in the area. Being alone with no friends and a few weeks into the summer, no girlfriend as well, I found myself very bored and with a lot of time on my hands. So one day, when Frankie called me and asked me if I wanted to go water skiing at his lake house 45 minutes away, I decided to take him up on the offer. I had nothing better to do and no friends around, so I said sure and went for it. The water skiing started off normal, with myself, Frankie, and another younger guy in his 20s, who I think was just a neighbor of Frankie's from the area. We went around the lake water skiing, boating, and drinking beers, having a good time. After leaving the lake, Frankie said we should head down to another college town, a much larger one, for a night out on him. Being cheap, bored, and a few drinks deep, I agreed to come along. Before we left, Frankie said he had to stop at his house to change, and told me I could crash on the couch after the night. This is when I started to feel unsettled. His house was a great old Victorian mansion. It even had one of those historic signs out front talking about the original owner. But the house was run down, very run down, with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, and the front porch sinking into the ground. When I went in for a tour, I had a very eerie feeling from the beginning. Inside, it looked like a museum, loaded with creepy porcelain dolls and old pictures and books. The air felt stagnant, like the windows were rarely opened and the dust had been there for decades. Then, creepiest of all, there was a door to a room that didn't match. It was an outside door to an inside room, and had all locks on the outside, both a door lock turned around and padlocks. Frankie disappeared upstairs to grab a few things and left me alone in the hallway. I was torn between wanting to get out, whether to wait outside or just keep walking down the road, or to look around and see what else was going on in this house. It really was like a museum from the Victorian era. All the furniture and decorations, and like they had been barely touched since then. The only two newer things were the padlocked door and the picture on the wall. A group of men who looked like the Italian mob in the 1970s. They all had slicked back hair and black suits, and looked seriously at the camera. Frankie was taking a long time upstairs, so I took a closer look at the door. There was a strange noise, almost like a whimper, and I pressed my ear up against it. Not a whimper, but distant cries. I could hear them through the door, faintly, but surely. I stepped back and nearly bumped into Frankie, who was standing behind me with a smile on his face. When I asked Frankie what's in the room, he just said, "Don't you worry about that room, it's just the cats." And the subject was dropped for the night. When we were leaving, I also noticed the top of the tower had just one red lamp lit in it. Nothing else but a red lamp behind the curtains. Frankie gave me a wink and said his house is in the red light district. Leaving that house, I felt creeped out to my core, skin crawling and like I needed to keep looking over my shoulder. Frankie didn't say anything else about his house, and I didn't ask. I did end up going out to the bar that night, but didn't have a drink. When we returned to the house and I was invited in to stay, I promptly made an excuse and hopped in my truck and noped out of there. About a week after that incident, the bar shut down, and I never heard from Frankie again. I've tried to look into who he really is, and all I found was an article from the State Bar Association saying he had been denied an appeal, saying his law degree was fraudulent. His story was always that he's a lawyer. Since that year, I haven't looked back on what the possibilities could have been. My friends say I'm lucky I wasn't the victim of a serial killer, or some type of sex trafficking ring. Most likely, I think the guy was just weird and trying to make his life more interesting than it was. But I was definitely creeped out by the situation. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 418. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. You know, I was trying to get the voice right for story number 1 there. So that, well, okay, frequently there will be interviews and the likes and with these kind of people on YouTube, and sure enough, there was a very lengthy video of basically he was in court admitting to all the things he'd done, and I thought, that guy's voice sounds so familiar. But to the point where it wasn't just, oh, I've obviously heard him talk before. It was, you know, he sounds like an actor. And I thought, is it Harmon? Mark Harmon from NCIS? I was like, no, it's not quite right. And then I realized he sounds a lot like the actor Matt Frewer, who once played Max Headroom. If you remember back in the 1980s, those of us who remember the 80s will remember the allegedly, computer-generated TV host Max Headroom, whereas it was just a guy in kind of like a plasticky makeup. I think it kind of like Jude Law from AI. That was a similar kind of look to that he had, and so that was actually, and that made it a lot easier because it meant I could watch less of him admitting to all his horrible crimes, and it was a voice that wasn't too far off from what one could kind of do. Because I remember when he played Professor Burlingham Rasmussen from Next Generation, so I was quite familiar with his voice and how he speaks, so that made it quite easy. Oh, also, I would like to say thank you very much to everybody who has been commenting on and watching and liking and sharing Thursday's glitch video. That seems to have worked out well. It has gotten far more views in less than a day than any other glitch video would have done. So that's encouraging, and I think we'll probably continue doing it that way for now, while it remains popular. Any other updates? I don't think so just now. It continues to be very melty here, so I'm going to try and plow through these videos. Then I can plop myself in the living room where I have many fans keeping me cool. Actually, I crawled up the street the other day. It was yesterday actually. It was the hottest day of the year so far, and I had to go searching because when it gets that hot, you suddenly find that fans, they get harder to find. And I've got a couple of pedestal fans, I've got a ceiling fan, but I wanted a floor one that I could just plop right in front of me and it would blast me and keep me cool. And eventually I did find one for a semi-reasonable price. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.